Being a Steam Deck owner, you probably know that what gives the deck the power to run Steam Windows games on this hardware is something called Proton. You may even have some basic ideas how it works, but parts of it may elude you. Just how does it work its magic? What is the difference between versions? Is it an emulator? The answer to all of these questions and more are coming up next. Stick around. I could give you some succinct definition from some website that tells you what Proton is, but I think discussing how it differs from the process and things you already know will help you better understand what it is and how it works. Let's start with your Windows computer. In my rather crude drawing, this PC could have one of many different versions of Windows. Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows 11, and while you might say to yourself, it doesn't really matter, it kind of does, and we'll explain why shortly. There are many ways to obtain games for use with this Windows PC. Some of them shady, like piracy, some installer you got off Usenet or torrents, but most people these days obtain their games through what I like to call a digital locker, such as Steam, Origin, Ubisoft Connect, and numerous others. Now, some people call these apps launchers because they actually launch games, but we have other uses for the word launcher in this video, so I'm going to try to halt the confusion at the door. Besides, digital lockers is kind of a fitting name. They lock up all your games digitally, holding you captive to a specific tool to play your games, and this will really come into play later. Time to get the party started. We will start by installing God of War from Steam's digital locker to your Windows 10 PC. Everyone has a C drive, or Windows drive, sometimes called the system drive, but most of us choose to install our big bloated games on a cheaper, higher capacity drive. Could be any drive letter, of course, but we'll make it easy and call it your D drive. We punch up God of War on Steam and then elect to install. Steam asks us where to put it, and we designate the D drive. The downloading of dozens of gigabytes of data starts from that good old internet. Once the game is finished downloading, it calls the game installer, setup.exe probably, a Windows app, and begins installing the game files on the D drive. Yeah, I know you're getting bored and I better get to the action quickly. This is all passé stuff you already know, right? I promise we'll get there. Hold out just a bit more. During the install of God of War, the Windows-based installation is going to check your Windows system drive, aka C drive, for some little things we call prerequisites, other software that needs to be installed for the game to run. These come in many forms, but things you might recognize are DirectX, Microsoft Visual C runtimes, Visual C++ runtimes. They go by many names, but the bottom line is, if your Windows C drive doesn't have these requisites already installed, the installer will do it for you. To add just a bit more complexity, I swear all of this pays off later, each version of Windows, be it XP, 7, 10, 11, may already have some of these, or even all of these, requisites already installed. If they already exist, the installer simply skips them and moves on to the next one. Now, let's not forget the bloated 20 gigabytes of other Windows files, DLLs, EXEs, libraries, registries, and all that Best Buy Geek Squad stuff that also already exists on your Windows drive. Most of them are common across all Windows versions and come in the box with Windows. Let's call these crazy guys base files for Windows. Right, so Steam has done its job. The game is sitting on your D drive, and all the crazy stuff we typically don't even think about, like requisites and base files, are sitting on the C drive, waiting to be called upon by the game when you run it from the new shortcut on your desktop, which of course runs the game through that digital locker Steam. All is right with the universe, yeah? Now, whether any of this information was new to you, having it broken down this way may have already got the wheels in your head churning about what Proton may have to do in order to get Windows games running on a Linux device like the Steam Deck. Let's move to our beloved Steam Deck. My incredibly poor rendering does it ill justice, but it matches the decor, so we'll go with it. The Steam Deck really only has one digital locker, Steam. Makes sense. This piece of hardware is built atop of SteamOS, which we all really know is just a flavor of Linux. Arch Linux, to be specific, but don't worry, that won't be on the quiz at the end. I know. Hold up now, before you start typing a comment that I'm a dirty, filthy liar, that Battle.net, Origin, and all those other lockers can be made to run on deck, you're absolutely right, this is true. But while Windows, the operating system on your PC, is merely a tool to run Windows apps, of which those other digital locker apps are, SteamOS is designed to run, well, Steam. And then Steam is the vessel that runs the games and apps installed. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, realistically, everything else is sort of a hack job, and I promise you we will get there, just bear with me. So we have our deck running a Linux version of Steam, sitting on top of a Linux distro. Clear as mud? Good. Let's move on. Now it is time to install that great, awesome masterpiece, God of War, as you already know is a Windows game. For parity, let's perform the same install as we did on Windows and see where things start to go in a different direction. On the deck, you bring up Steam, just like Windows. So far, so good. You ask it to install, and Steam asks you where you want to put it. Well, now that's a great question. Every Steam Deck has internal storage, be it 64, 256, or 512 gigabytes. This might be comparable to, say, your PC's C drive. Guaranteed to be there, but no guarantee of free space. See how much like Windows this is? Naturally, if you have a deck-formatted microSD card installed in the deck, you can install your Steam game to that location instead of the internal storage, which I guess sort of makes your SD card like your D or data drive, right? This is lining up perfectly. Nothing can go wrong. Where were we? Oh yes, we downloaded 60 gigabytes of God of War and Steam was getting ready to install it. This is where things get a bit hairy, and it's probably the part of the video you skip to instead of sitting through the useful background information that will make all this part relatable. Let's see how you do. If you recall, God of War is a Windows game. It has a Windows installer. It needs Windows prerequisites to be installed. It needs base files for Windows. Linux doesn't have these. Linux is Linux, and SteamOS is just a Linux app that is running the show. Proton. Yeah, settle down. If you're so clever, why are you watching this video anyway? Okay, never mind. Time to get our hands dirty. We all know that God of War installs and plays just fine on the Steam Deck. It's the hows and whys that make Proton such an amazing piece of work. So what the hell is it already? The bottom line is, Windows apps needs Windows to run. You would be totally forgiven for thinking that Proton is an emulator. After all, we can run NES and Game Boy games on our PC, and our PC is not a Game Boy or NES. Might crash less if it was, and that is all via the power of emulation. To understand what Proton is, you must understand what Proton is not. It is not an emulator. Maybe you've heard in passing of a little something called Wine, and not the stuff you get your wife plowed on for sex night. Wine, in short, allows you to run Windows software on Linux operating systems. I know, still sounds like an emulator, right? You know, WINE is an acronym that roughly stands for Wine is not an emulator. Look it up if you don't believe me. Despite the circular definition that doesn't largely make sense, it's true. WINE is not an emulator. So what is it? It's a compatibility layer that intercepts Windows program requests or calls for service and essentially translates them on the fly into the Linux equivalent where possible. Look, you Linux heads, I don't need your lecture and comments. This is a 101 course, and you probably shouldn't even be watching it, so I beseech you, no disparaging comments. Thank you. Where was I? Oh yes. Wine is a translation layer you might also hear called a compatibility layer. Think of Wine as a speech translator. You're speaking English, but you need to converse with a native Spanish speaker. Now, he's not learning English, and you're not learning Spanish, so you have to have a translator if anything's going to get done. So where does Wine fall into the Proton story? Well, the very core of Proton starts with a rather heavily modified version of Wine. Wait, who's modifying Wine for Proton? That would be a joint effort between the developers Codeweavers and Valve, who both are contributing to the development of Proton. Now, in addition to that heavily modified Wine, there are tons more files and libraries included to make that translation better and more accurate. All right, back to the installation. Thanks to Proton, the Windows-based installer for God of War now runs through Proton and is translated accordingly. We said earlier that Windows apps must have Windows to run. Now, we know that isn't exactly true, but that doesn't alleviate the need for portions of Windows that are inherent to Windows. These are those pesky base files, the DLLs, executables, libraries, the registry, all that good stuff. The teams behind Proton have created these base files in a somehow legal way to be accessed by the installer and the game it does install. The team behind Proton have created these base files in a somehow legal way to be accessed by the installer and the game it installs. So we know the installer runs now, but what about those prerequisites, the DirectX, the Visual C++, etc.? Those are all just more Windows apps, right? Proton will take care of ensuring those prerequisites get installed along with the game. Sweet. Now, thanks to the Proton compatibility layer, the base files for Windows are there, including a fake C drive within, more on that later, and even a fake registry for those games that need it. The installer requisites are there. And of course, the game is neatly installed on your microSD card. When you run the game, Proton is there to execute the game's launch exe and anything else it might call. Perfect. Nothing can go wrong. Of course, if you wanted to say install Rocket League on the Steam Deck, there's both a Windows and Linux version of the game, so there's no real need for Proton here. SteamOS will download the Linux version if you like, and you can leave your Brawly and your Proton at home. Before we leave the topic of Steam-installed Windows games running under Proton, it should be noted that unlike non-Steam added Windows games running under Proton, Steam organizes and uses some slightly different methodology for the storage and configuration of these games. Now we'll get back to specifics later, but for now understand there's a difference between Steam and non-Steam games and apps in terms of how they're organized under the hood. Let's move on to the topic of how adding non-Steam games work, highlighting the differences and challenges one might encounter. This leads us to one of the most common uses for the feature: Origin, Battle.net, Ubisoft, GOG, and all those other digital lockers. Those digital lockers are not part of SteamOS like they are for Windows, nor are they available in the Steam library. But as Windows programs, we can use Proton to run them just like we did game installers and requisite installers. Fortunately, Steam allows us to add any non-Steam gamer app to Steam and run it. Since we're likely to be adding Windows apps and not Linux apps, thanks to Steam and Proton, these digital locker apps install, but there's a bit more magic involved, and we're going to come to that shortly. Let's use Battle.net as an example. Battle.net is a Windows application that downloads and manages games, like Overwatch. Sort of like Steam, but focused only on Blizzard and Activision games. Just like Steam on Windows, you must download the installer, install Battle.net, then use it to install, then subsequently launch. Just like Steam on Windows, you must download the installer, install Battle.net, then use it to install and subsequently launch the games it has dominion over. To play Overwatch, we're going to need a new non-Steam game, pointing at the Battle.net installation exe that we download from the Battle.net website. Since Steam has no idea what the hell we're trying to install, it creates a standalone Proton Prefix. This is a specially numbered folder that essentially houses its own self-contained version of Proton. Oh, by the way, you need to specify which version of Proton you want to use. It doesn't know. Right. You've added your non-Steam game entry to Steam, you've pointed it to the Battle.net installer exe, chosen a version of Proton, and we hit play. Now, as you would expect, Battle.net's installer launches, you pick a language and a location to install. Wait, what? Install on the C drive? How is that possible? This isn't Windows, there's no C drive. It's cool. Steam and Proton created a fake C drive, a fake registry, and a fake everything else you need within that Proton Prefix folder. When you tell the installer to install on the C drive, it's really being installed inside that custom Proton Prefix's fake C drive. That looks strikingly like a Windows system drive if you look at it. So normally Battle.net installs in the programs folder of the Windows C drive. It does the same here. Remember, Proton prefixes are stored on the deck's internal drive. You really have no choice in the matter. You're probably thinking, dude, I cannot afford to install non-Steam games on my tiny ass 64 gigabyte internal drive. We're going to talk about that later. Don't get too far ahead. For now, understand that Battle.net did install inside of a Proton prefix inside your internal storage drive on the deck. If you run that non-Steam app again, it's going to appear to launch BlizzardNet because when you run the installer app, it knows it was installed and just launches the installed app for you. Not ideal though, since that install exe is probably in your downloads folder and the actual game launcher is inside that fake C drive that Proton made earlier. The solution, of course, is to change the non-Steam game entry in Steam to point to the BlizzardNet program exe, not the installer. Easy enough, as long as you know where that Proton prefix is on your file system and how to figure out which one of the numerous prefixes belongs to the title you just installed. I have a whole video dedicated to that and will include it in the description. But what we have now is a self-contained Proton Prefix edition of the Windows Digital Locker app for Battle.net. We've come a long way. Pause the video, take a breather, and we'll move on. Battle.net is useless without some games installed on it, right? If you were to launch Battle.net right now and install Overwatch, the only place you can install it to is the fake C drive that Proton set up. This is, of course, on your internal storage. We don't want that, right? We need that sucker installed on the micro SD card. But that isn't a function of a non-Steam app, nor does Proton Prefix support this out of the box. We're going to need a special mount command so that this non-Steam game can peruse outside of the Proton Prefix's fake C drive. You add that to the non-Steam game's launcher options, and since the command is long and spacing is important, I'll add the command in the description below so you can cut and paste it as needed. Now, if you launch Battle.net, you're ready to install Overwatch. This time when you hit Browse to tell Battle.net what folder to install to, you will have access to your micro SD card as a location. When you install Overwatch, the game is installed into that micro SD card location. But wait, what about these base Windows files we keep talking about? No worries, those are provided by the Proton prefix. What about requisites like DirectX, C++, and all that? During the install of Overwatch, those installers are redirected to the fake C drive and will be available when Overwatch runs. Wow, so that means Battle.net will run, right? And then Overwatch should run too, yeah? Well, there's a niggle here. Much like every version of Windows is a little bit different, so is every version of Proton. Now, you might think that the higher the version, the better. And normally that's, well, sort of right. After all, Valve and CodeWeavers are supposed to be improving on Proton with every new release. But just like Windows, there are some things that only run on Windows XP and not on Windows 11, despite Windows 11 being newer and, quote, better than Windows XP. If you're following along and your eyes aren't glazed over, then you realize that sometimes you may have to use a different version of Proton for certain games or applications to run. There's a great tool online called the Proton DB that can assist you in figuring out some of this stuff. I'll have a link in the description below. The good news is that like 98% of the time, the highest version of Proton you have should do the trick. Before we move on though, let's talk about something that confuses the newbie. It sure confused me. The differences between Proton and something everyone talks about called GE Proton. The Proton versions we have on the deck are those that are ratified as known good by Valve. The latest at the time of this video was 7.0.2. Of course, there is a bleeding edge version called experimental, but that version is still a bit behind. Behind what? Oh, remember I said the core of Proton was Wine, as in Wine is not an emulator? Official Proton builds are not using the latest version of Wine. Remember, Valve is looking for stability for deck users, but as a power user now, you may want to tap every resource at your disposal to get the widest field of compatibility and performance. GE Protons are just Proton versions built from newer core pieces like Wine. You can get these versions by using the Proton Up app you install from the Discover tool on your deck's desktop. Once you install something like GE Proton 7-20, restart Steam and it will be available for you in the compatibility dropdown for your non-Steam game launcher. Sorry for the detour there, we needed to get that out of the way. Personally, I always start with the latest GE Proton, and if it doesn't work, I'll hit the Proton DB to see what others have recommended. I don't start there because it is community driven and the community sometimes doesn't really agree. I don't mind taking a whack at it myself first. Look how far we've come. We understand what black magic is going on in the background when we install a non-Steam app. We know about Proton and its various versions. We know we have to change the pointer of a non-Steamer game launcher to point to the actual installed app's exe instead of the installed file. Wait, what's that? Can you change the launcher to point to the game itself instead of the digital locker? You can. But as you know, part of the quote feature of digital lockers is to lock your games up inside of them. Some of them, like BattleNet here, will let you point to the game's exe, but still fully launch BattleNet, and you'll still have to click play on the BattleNet screen, effectively making the action of repointing it to the game's exe useless and, well, a waste of your time. Other digital lockers, though, like Ubisoft, will still run the locker in the background, but will launch your game directly. In that case, yes, point non-Steam game launchers to the game exe itself. The Proton prefix attached to this non-Steam game is still there. So the digital locker app, the base Windows files, the requisites, fake registry, all of that is still there when you call the game directly instead of through the launcher. By the way, the lesson we just did, that is installing a non-Steam game, isn't restricted to just digital lockers. If you have a standalone game installer, say one you downloaded directly from GOG or another old game you had from the good old days before everybody wanted to shackle you to their company's locker, you do the same thing that you did for BattleNet. Point to the installer exe first, install the game, and then point the non-Steam game launcher to the game's exe within the Proton prefix or wherever else you decided to put it. What about piracy? Maybe you have the latest El Amigo crack for some horrible de novo protected game and you would rather use that than the slowed down gimped protected version that you purchased. Well, this is hit and miss. Now, remember, piracy assumes you're running on Windows, right? They assume base window files. They may not include or install for you the requisites that are needed, expecting you to do this if you need them, etc. We're in crapshoot territory here. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. Your mileage may vary, void where prohibited. Before we move on, we have one more very common scenario to walk through and explain. That is the user that tries to blindly copy a game's installed folder from Windows to the deck, then setting up a non-Steam game entry to point to it. Let's say I were to copy the game folder for Gas Station Simulator from my Windows C drive's Program Files directory to the Steam Deck's SD card folder. I then point a non-Steam game entry to run the game's exe file. Oh, yeah, I did pick a Proton version too. Will it work? Pause the video for a moment and contemplate if you think it will work based on the knowledge you've gained so far. I'll wait for just a moment, then come back and we'll talk about it. The answer is always maybe, but probably not. Let's check your work. Since we designated a version of Proton, we have base files for Windows. Check, that's good. Based on that, the game should at least try to start loading. Well, maybe. This is where things usually go sideways. If you said prerequisites are missing so the game probably won't run, then you get a star. The previously installed games are not going to have those requisites in the system folders on the Windows drive. Those were installed into the Windows system drive during the install process, and those are not present in this Proton prefix. After that, numerous other things could be missing, right? Random files the game put in your profile folders on Windows, things like game saves, and even if the game ran, the saves probably existed in a folder outside of the game folder, and when you run it on deck, it will be like starting over. If you could find those save files and move them to the Proton prefix, it's the same place on that fake C drive as on your real C drive. Sure, it would actually pick those saves up. Now, there's a half a dozen other things that could blow up a game brought over to the deck this way. Missing support files, registry entries, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on and on. The bottom line is, this is not the right way to do it. Always use Steam. a game's digital locker, or at the very least, the game's original installer to install the game on deck via Proton. We've covered a lot of stuff here, and fortunately it's in video format so you can watch it a couple of times if it didn't sink in all the way. Once you've performed these evolutions a few times, it will seem like no big deal. Just remember when you're answering posts for help on Reddit that it isn't second nature to them yet, and go easy on them. Or better yet, help them get educated by pointing them to this video. All right, at this point you should know what Proton is used for, what the components are that gives it the magic that it does. You understand that older versions of Proton could work better than newer ones. You know what a Proton Prefix is, roughly what's inside and the purpose. You know the different means to get games and applications running through Proton using the non-Steam application feature in Steam. Finally, you are fully clear that a game installed on your Windows PC is not standalone, ready to run sort of thing, and it requires base files from Windows, requisites installed, and in many cases will simply never run right on the deck if you simply copy it over. Now, I will include links to a couple of other videos of mine that will assist you more in understanding Proton prefixes and the space they take up, as well as several videos showing the installation of popular digital lockers and games installed inside of them. Armed with all of those and this video, you should be well on your way to mastering Proton and your Steam Deck. All right, everybody, this is Shane R. Monroe. As always, I thank you so much for watching my videos. Please like, subscribe, hit the little notification bell. And please, if you like the video, just comment. Leave a quick comment saying, I loved it. I hated it. Shane, you talk too fast. Shane, you talk too slow. I already knew all this crap. Make better videos. Whatever it is, I want to hear your comments in the comment section below. Comments are very important to getting the YouTube engine to help promote this video so that others might find it. As always, we'll see you next time. And take care.